It was the circus, the Ice Capades, and the carnival all rolled into one, fixing forever in the minds of Americans, and indeed millions of Europeans, the Wild West as Buffalo Bill saw it.
Okay, go.
It's probably Don Russell that rescued Buffalo Bill from, shall we say, buffoonery. No one ever rescued Buffalo Bill from anonymity, for he never suffered from anonymity. But not long after his death, he became somewhat of a caricature, a funny old man telling braggadocious exploits about his time in the West, and not everyone believed that Buffalo Bill was what he seemed to be. Don Russell changed that with his biography, The Lives and Legends of Buffalo Bill. It may be his greatest in a large field of contributions. It may be his greatest contribution to Western history. For Buffalo Bill was real. Everything he did was real. In fact, this is one time that the man may be greater than legend itself. By the time he was 22 years old, he was watching himself portrayed on stage by other actors. By the time he was 25, he himself was going on stage, and he was working in the wintertime back on the stage and in the summertime scouting for the Army. And in 1872, he would leave the Army for what would be, he thought, good, and go on the stage and make his fortune. And he has to be one of the most colorful and amazing characters in all of American history. He was already famous. The Battle of Summit Springs in 1869 gained him national fame, headlines in the New York Times. It was here he probably killed Tall Bull, the Cheyenne warrior. I say probably because, like nearly everything in history, we're not sure exactly who killed Tall Bull, but certainly it was Buffalo Bill that led the soldiers there, led Eugene Carr and the cavalry, and it was Buffalo Bill that played a very large part in the Battle of Summit Springs, the last major Indian engagement in the plains of Colorado. It made him nationally famous. He'd already served great officers. He was a friend of Custer, a friend of Hickok's, a friend of Sheridan's. He knew Sherman. Already the young scout was being talked about everywhere. In the early 70s, Ned Buntline, a rather unsavory character, began casting about for a way to make a quick dollar, for Buntline was always in need of quick dollars. He went west looking for a character to write about, a character that could make him some money, a character he could build upon. He went to Frank North first, and Frank North reportedly didn't want all of this publicity and said, "See that fellow over there? That's your fellow." And the fellow was, of course, the sleeping young Buffalo Bill. Ned Buntline made Buffalo Bill famous. Ned Buntline wrote dime novels. He wrote dime novels in between his drinking bouts, and when he wasn't preaching temperance, he wrote dime novels well. And so before Buffalo Bill ever got on the stage, he was already a very famous personage. In 1871, when the Grand Duke Alexis came to the United States, heir apparent to the throne of Russia, General Sheridan set up a buffalo hunt. The party arrived in Denver, and of course Buffalo Bill would be asked to lead the buffalo hunt as the scout. The Grand Duke Alexis was delighted. Others chosen were General George Armstrong Custer, now Lieutenant Colonel, commanding the 7th Cavalry in the field. There was a grand ball in Denver, drinking and partying in tuxedos. And the word came, for they'd stationed men out on the plains, that buffalo had been sighted, and the party broke up immediately, and they got on the specially chartered train and headed for the plains, where Buffalo Bill would teach the Grand Duke Alexis the fine art of killing buffalo, for no one knew more about it than he did. And so he went. From the plains, from a scout, from the Civil War, to becoming one of the most famous men in the world. And he got there with the Wild West. But he never called it the show, never called it the Wild West show. To him it was always an exhibition of the great things he'd seen and the things he'd done. Oh, maybe they were a little grander when he retold them, but he did them. He was there in person, and it makes all the difference in the world. It's very hard for us to imagine the impact that a show like the Wild West would have if it had come to our town in, say, 1889. By 1889, you probably would have seen woodcuts, maybe some of the early photographs, but imagine, if you can, the thrill of having world-famous Buffalo Bill, perhaps with Sitting Bull, Geronimo, Irontail, some of his other friends, all appearing here in your hometown. You really can't imagine, because for those of us jaded by television and motion pictures and getting in jet planes and traveling, it's beyond our veil of imagination. But there was no thrill today that we could experience like seeing the real Buffalo Bill in real life in our hometown, because it would be beyond our veil of experience. And this is the kind of thrill that Buffalo Bill brought to millions. The Wild West started in 1883, and it would run almost 30 years as his own show. He made his very last appearance in November of 1916 and would die just a couple of months later, January of 1917. He virtually lived out his life on the stage, in the arena, in the public eye. And oh, while sometimes it was not always exemplary, it was always uniquely Buffalo Bill. With players like Johnny Baker and the world-famous Annie Oakley and Buffalo and the Deadwood Stage and the ever-present Indians, Buffalo Bill's Wild West exposition must have been really something to see. Contemporary to it, it's interesting to know that the Bailey Circus started in '84, 1 year after the Wild West. Encompassing more than just the Wild West, it soon became Buffalo Bill's Wild West and Congress of the Rough Riders of the World, in which Buffalo Bill brought in troops of cavalry from all over the world, Arab horsemen, Mexican vaqueros, Argentine gauchos, Japanese household cavalry, German Uhlans. From all over the world they came and they rode in this spectacle. The United States wasn't large enough to hold him. He decided in '87 to take the Wild West show, which he never termed it show, but he decided to take the Wild West across the ocean to England and into Europe. And the crowned heads of Europe loved it. There were two amazing firsts that happened in 1887. Queen Victoria had not been to a public performance in the 25 years since her husband had died. And when she learned that the Wild West could not be brought to her, she came to the Wild West show for the first time, appearing in public in 25 years. A second, and perhaps even more of a landmark thing happened at this time. When the parade came around and the American flag was in the front, the Queen of England, for the first time since the Declaration of American Independence, stood up and saluted the American flag. And that's what Buffalo Bill's Wild West show did. Kings and queens flocked to the show. They loved it. At one time he had 4 kings and the Prince of Wales riding in the Deadwood coach, attacked by vicious Indians and saved by the cavalry. Oh, it was history. History with a touch of Barnum and Bailey and Wild Bill Hickok and, of course, Buffalo Bill. And everyone loved the show, and the spectacle got better and better. Annie Oakley came along. Annie Oakley was one of the greatest marksmen of all time, and she would perform with Buffalo Bill until a tragic accident hurt her back, an accident with the Buffalo Bill's train. Annie Oakley wasn't the only woman with the show. It was always a show that prided itself on being equal for women. Buffalo Bill had a very interesting comment to make about women's lib. In 1889, a reporter asked him, "Do you think women are equal to men?" I think his reply is interesting. "Most assuredly I do. I've already said they should be allowed to vote. Why, of course, if a woman is going out, earning her living, and she keeps up with what is going on in the world, and she knows the best man to vote for. Men have their clubs, and I say let the women have theirs too. Women are so much better than we are that they don't take to our kind of clubs. But if they want to meet and discuss financial questions, politics, or any other subject, let them do it." A rather revolutionary thought for 1889. But Buffalo Bill was the man of the West, and women's lib came from the West, and Buffalo Bill was a rather revolutionary man. Annie Oakley, of course, was not the only attraction. There were many, many great attractions. The Deadwood stagecoach chase and the saving of the coach by the cavalry was always very famous. He always caught bandits or outlaws. Jack McCandles was one of the favorite. Another one of the great acts was Johnny Baker, who was the adopted son of Buffalo Bill, who would later become so important in the running of the show. Johnny Baker was an excellent marksman, and while he perhaps was not as good as Annie Oakley, he was great in his own right. Johnny Baker would later help establish the Museum to Buffalo Bill in Denver. One of the greatest parts of the show's spectacle was the Battle of Summit Springs. It was often replaced by Custer's Last Stand. Bill hadn't been at Custer's Last Stand, and perhaps it was one of the things he regretted, because what a great chance for him for publicity. Nonetheless, right after Custer, Bill had been called back into the service, and it made for one of the greatest spectacles of all of his shows, First Scalp for Custer. General Wesley Merritt was bringing the cavalry to the aid of George Crook in hopes of catching the Indians who had killed Custer. Merritt, using the services of Buffalo Bill, discovered the Cheyenne Indians near Warbonnet Creek, also called Hat Creek. In one of the very rare instances, one of the ironic turns in American history, the cavalry ambushed the Indians. And there Buffalo Bill, in a somewhat hand-to-hand battle with one of the Indians called Yellow Hand, Bill killed this Indian singly in combat, and as the troopers rushed by, he raised the war bonnet up in his hand and said, "First Scalp for Custer." This became later a very famous painting by Robert Lindo. The words became a rallying cry for the Custer Avengers that would defend Custer's honor after the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and this made a great and very dramatic scene in all of the Wild West shows after that. It ranked right there with Summit Springs, with Custer's Last Stand, the fight on Warbonnet Creek, or First Scalp for Custer. So you see, the material that Bill used in the Wild West show actually came from real life. While perhaps embellished, he was there. He really did do it. He won a Medal of Honor. It would later be taken away from him because they found he wasn't a military employee, but it was a civilian at the time. But all of these were real, and Buffalo Bill was real, and it made the difference in this Wild West show, because Buffalo Bill had been there and he had done it. Perhaps more than anyone else, Buffalo Bill colored the way we always saw the American West. By the time the Wild West died out, by the time the shows had ceased to draw the crowds that they had drawn before, in the 1913-1916 period, you have to remember the motion picture was just coming in. Buffalo Bill and the motion picture camera were made for each other. It was almost as though Thomas Edison had invented this magnificent device to further glorify the actions of Buffalo Bill. I think it rather ironic that in 1898, the piece of film that was filed for copyright for the motion picture was a picture of the Wild West show going down the streets of New York. We'll see that picture in shortly. It may be the oldest surviving footage on record. Buffalo Bill was filmed as early as 1894 by Edison, and many of his Wild West acts were filmed individually. Buffalo Bill in 1913 formed his own picture company. Already the Wild West show was beginning to diminish in impact. The movies were taking away some of his audiences, and so he decided to create his own movies. They made several. The most important one, however, we do not have much footage from, and it's a great shame. He decided to recreate the entire history of the Indian Wars and got with himself Nelson Miles, Charles King, and many of the Indians who had actually participated in the Indian Wars, as well as Wounded Knee, all got together and went to Wounded Knee and actually refilmed several of the battles of the Indian Wars, Miles participating himself, a four-star general. Because of Miles' involvement and because of Cody's stature, they were loaned United States troops and full help of the War Department. The resulting film has been lost. There are bits and pieces of it, but it may be one of the greatest testaments ever to the history of the Indian Wars, and someday hopefully it will be found. But by getting his Wild West show photographed, by putting it onto film, Buffalo Bill did something else. He colored for all time the way we would see the American West. Other actors would see this film. Other actors perhaps had been to the show, had seen the Wild West show itself, and so when they made movies, when the Bronco Billy Andersons, when the Tim McCoys made their movies, they could turn to the footage of the Buffalo Bill Wild West show, and they could see what they wore. And if what they wore was a little grander than what was real, that's the way we'd portray it. If the hats were a little bigger, if the vests were a little brighter, if the chaps were a little more fancy, that's the way we'd see them in early Westerns. And indeed, he colored forever the way we'll look at the Wild West. Buffalo Bill's contributions to the West are legion. The tendency to look upon him as an old and doddering man comes from the fact that, perhaps like a great pro quarterback that played just a little too long, Buffalo Bill drug out the appearances beyond his prime. Toward the very end, they used to have to first lift him into the saddle. He was so pained by rheumatism. And he rode once around the arena and waved his hat to the crowd, and then rode back behind the curtain and had to be lifted bodily off his horse. At the very last, when he was making his farewell appearances, and it's interesting, his first farewell appearances were his last appearances in the saddle. He then went to farewell appearances driving a coach. And it is here that people began to think that this poor old man never did those things, but he did them. And when he died in 1917 in Denver, and ironically he died broke, a man who'd made millions and run through them, who'd been both a millionaire and broke many times, died in 1917 in Denver, and congressmen and senators attended. It was the largest funeral in all of the history of Denver, and they buried him on Lookout Mountain. That's rather unusual, too, because Buffalo Bill had always stated that he wanted to be buried near Cody, Wyoming, the town he'd created, the town named for him. And it was widely rumored that Henry Tammon of the Denver Post paid $10,000 to the widow in order that Bill could be buried here, for it made great newspaper copy, and people came from all over. They held the body in a storage vault until they could get to the top of Lookout Mountain and the road was passable. And then the parade up the hill was again almost a circus. It was reported that there were at least 6 ladies in black beside the widow herself who grieved over the passing of Buffalo Bill, perhaps from a personal experience. A man as grand as Bill couldn't be covered by one simple museum. There are 3 museums devoted primarily to Buffalo Bill himself. Scout's Rest, his home in Nebraska and North Platte, has some excellent displays. You can see part of the working ranch that Buffalo Bill built, some of the only actual tangible things he had because his wife wouldn't let him put it up for credit. At Lookout Mountain in Denver, where his grave sits, there's a beautiful museum to Buffalo Bill filled with memorabilia, filled with posters, bronzes, photographs, and of course they have the body there. And then there's the historical center, the Buffalo Bill Historical Center in Cody, Wyoming. One of America's premier museums. It contains so much of Buffalo Bill that he almost comes alive. A man so grand that it takes 3 museums to encompass him. A man who changed history forever. A man who colored the American West in the way we see it. A scout, a Civil War soldier, a Medal of Honor winner, a movie star, friend and confidant of kings, queens, princes, and presidents. An old drunk at the corner bar sometime. He was all of these things. But he was greater than any of them. The legend of Buffalo Bill will grow and grow because of the films, because of the shows, and because he was one of the great men in American history. And so now, ladies and gentlemen, I give you the Honorable William Frederick Cody, Buffalo Bill.
Ladies and gentlemen, permit me to introduce to you a Congress of the Rough Riders of the World.
You've just heard the voice of Buffalo Bill as recorded in 1898, and what you're about to see is the actual footage that Thomas Edison filed for copyright in 1898 to copyright his marvelous invention, the motion picture. The subject, of course, Buffalo Bill's Wild West. Here's the parade down New York streets in 1898, some of the rarest footage available. It may not be wonderful, and any child with a Brownie box camera could duplicate it today, but in 1898 it was certainly one of the marvels of the world, and we are very fortunate this film has been saved. You will see in the next few reels what the visitor to the Wild West might have seen in the 1890s to 1910, when the Wild West was at its height, touring the United States and Europe. It began with a grand parade down the city streets, sure to excite and elicit all the attention of everyone within miles and miles. And so, like the Pied Piper, they led them to the big tents. This parade got the fever pitch, and they came to see the Wild West and the Congress of the Rough Riders of the world. Setting up the tents were really something. Buffalo Bill mechanized very early. You're watching an extremely early automated pile driver that set the tents up. This was so efficient that the German army copied this in the early trips in 1910 and used some of Bill's methods of loading, unloading, and setting up the tents. The Grand Review was the way they began every show. Buffalo Bill would make his announcement, and the Congress of Rough Riders would parade by. Here, beginning with the American Indian, always a very favorite part of Buffalo Bill's Wild West. Bill was always a very good friend to the Indian. The limited mobility of the camera becomes evident, and yet still, considering the age, this is a marvel. And we're indeed fortunate to have footage like this to allow us to look at Buffalo Bill's Wild West. After the Indians came cavalry from all over the nation, cowboys, gauchos, vaqueros, German, French, Japanese, Mongol. He gathered them all, and they paraded before the excited crowds, never having left their hometown, some of them. And so you can imagine what the thrill must have been like to see German soldiers and Japanese cavalry and Mongolians, as well as the American Indians. The thrill is unimagined today, for nothing can match it. Arab horsemen, gauchos from Argentina, and even Japanese household cavalry. Followed in the end by dress uniforms of the United States Army. And always, of course, Buffalo Bill addressing the crowd from horseback in this scene, and when he couldn't be mounted on horseback, from stagecoach or from Surrey or from buggy. But Bill was there because he was the Wild West. These are some of the greatest pictures of Indians you will ever see. They are real Indians, no Hollywood actors here. The show varied from time to time, but always there were feats of marksmanship. In this case, Johnny Baker, the semi-adopted son of Buffalo Bill. Johnny Baker was a tremendous shot himself, a hometown boy, and he does some feats that are incredible here. Unfortunately, no footage exists today of Annie Oakley, undoubtedly the most famous marksman with the Wild West. She often was played in friendly duels against Johnny Baker. Baker was in his own right quite a remarkable shot. The same is true also of Buffalo Bill, who often shot 87 out of 100 glass balls out of the air mounted. Oh yes, they were using shot and not solid shot, because shot would have about a 3-inch pattern, but it still wasn't much of a pattern if you were shooting at glass balls tossed in the air from mounted. It was all in all a very remarkable feat, whether they were using shell or shot. The bucking broncos. It's hard for us to imagine scenes like this today, with all of the chutes and the mechanical devices we have to be sure the rider gets well mounted. Here, mounting was half the battle, and sometime, as you will see in this rare footage, they didn't win the battle. Imagine, if you can, trying to get on that bucking horse with no help from a chute and only one runner to help you hold him down. In this case, the wild horse looks alarmingly like a mule, and certainly kicks like one. The mud doesn't help either. Well, maybe this is what made it the Wild West. Well, that's one way to get on board. Maybe. And once on board, the fun began. The limited range of the camera is evident in these shots. Sometimes the action rides right out of sight. The Deadwood stage was probably the most popular act of all. The actual stage resides today at the Buffalo Bill Museum at Cody in beautiful restored condition. It brought the crowd standing every time, and many famous personages rode in it, a number of kings, queens, princes, and princesses. The routine didn't vary a great deal. The coach would make a round, everyone would wave to the crowd, and soon, inevitably, the Indians would appear. The pace would pick up, the coach would tear off, the Indians chasing, firing and screaming and shouting, and the crowd would go wild. Hand-to-hand combat on top of the coach. Terrified passengers inside. What ho, the U.S. cavalry comes to the rescue, and they always made it just in the nick of time. The Deadwood coach, attacked many times, was never overcome. The cavalry always made it, and the crowd always loved it. One of the most amazing acts were the Zouaves, in this case Devlin Zouaves. Zouave was a particular kind of French army unit, very specifically a uniform, baggy trousers, rather funny hat. This is a professional drill team of the likes I've never seen. Their performance is truly remarkable. Whoops, we kind of slipped on the front row, but it's about the only slip you'll see in this take. As must be obvious by now, they didn't believe in retakes in 1898. They just took it as it was. In this case, it's pretty darn good. That's a 24-foot square those men are performing on. A remarkable display by any standards. Pretty remarkable piece of film, too. We're not quite through. After the salute, we're going to attack that formidable obstacle behind them. Actually, the obstacle never stood a chance. Now, this is the way to get over that hill. But what about the last two guys? How are they going to get over? That's how. Object taken, flag waved. A truly amazing performance. Devlin Zouaves. Zooming Bill into the spotlight was the Battle of Summit Springs in 1869 in Colorado, not far from the town of Sterling. The site today is a state monument. Tall Bull and the Cheyenne Indians had raided through Kansas and Colorado. Growing a little complacent, they had decided to stop just before crossing the Platte River. Behind them was coming Eugene Carr and the 5th Cavalry, with the scout Buffalo Bill. These are some great scenes of Indians pitching camp, the kind you'll never see again, and there is little doubt they're real Indians. Their finery may be a little fancy, but they're real, and never to be forgotten scenes. With them were 2 white captives the Indians had brought. Buffalo Bill, Eugene Carr, and the cavalry were trying to save the captives and punish these Indians. In true Indian fashion, it would be the Indian women that would do all the work. The men sat around discussing important issues of the day, smoking pipes, and generally resting to save themselves for the battle ahead, if there was one. The white captives were seen just a moment ago in the last scene. We'll see them again. The Indians were totally unsuspecting, never dreaming that Carr was as close as he was, or that Buffalo Bill was leading him there. It is doubtful that there was this much celebration going on because they were all very tired from a very long, hard chase. Nonetheless, it was very picturesque, and it's a great chance to see some of the Indian dances. There's one of the white captives you notice in the left background. We've just passed around her. With this much reveling going on, it's no wonder the 5th Cavalry had little trouble defeating these Indians. There you see the white woman being dragged around by the squaw of Tall Bull. And Tall Bull is intervening. They're both white captives. The grave of one is still there at Summit Springs. When the Indians heard the cavalry approach, one of the women was killed, the other was saved. It is true the women were mistreated. And that's what we're trying to show quite subtly in this scene. That beautiful white horse would be captured by Buffalo Bill, and he would ride him much later. He named the horse in honor of the chief, Tall Bull. It won many a race for Buffalo Bill and became a very famous horse. Whoops, it looks like the word's out. The cavalry's coming. Actually, the attack was an almost complete surprise. When this happened, the squaws brought out the white women, and one of them was killed, probably by Tall Wolf's wife. Tall Bull's wife. The action moved so fast it was hard to see Buffalo Bill, but he rode right into the scene, and now the cavalry have saved one of the women, and the other is killed. A great piece of action, probably Buffalo Bill's most famous fight, or at least it's a toss-up between this and Warbonnet Creek. Certainly it was always a great crowd pleaser. No small feat when you consider the size of the arena to have all of this action. Cavalry, Indians, the white captives, the charge, and all done inside of an arena. Quite amazing. We're now going to pick up some movie footage. It's obvious this was not done in the Wild West setting, but it was one of the very famous scenes in almost every Wild West. You'd have the attack on the covered wagon. And so we have stolen this from a movie called Buffalo Bill's Dream to show you what the attack on the covered wagon might have looked like. Oh, it wouldn't have been as grand and expansive, but you get a pretty good idea from seeing this footage. It's from scenes like this that the Western got its earliest look at the cowboy, and these would forever color how we saw the American West because this film survived. Bill himself at this time must have been about 64, not in bad shape, and he rides a horse magnificently. And he fires into the air. Dispatch that engine. Note the Indians. They can mount on the wrong side, which is your first clue that these are real Indians. Ever vigilant, there's Bill out looking to save the wagon train. And there's the Indians looking for the wagon train. And there's the wagon train we're all looking for. Bill brings in the news. Prepare for the attack. If you look at all the later Westerns, this is the garb that they copied. Whatever they were wearing in the Wild West show is exactly what they wore in the early Westerns. Building a barricade of saddles. Cowgirls right by the men. Again, it's the Cheyenne that are the bad guys. Don't know where the Sioux are all this time. Here's one of my favorite scenes. Just so everyone would know who was the boss, please note the tent on the right. That's not even written in Cheyenne. But oh, are these great Indians. Of course, it could have been played quite so long or quite so grand if we'd seen it in the confines of a Wild West arena. Nonetheless, it does give you an idea of what it must have looked like. Here they come, boys. Well, let's change the defense line. Now we're about to see some furious and sometimes hand-to-hand fighting. Most of the shooting, you notice, is done in the air. Fighting looks real enough. That dead Indian's having trouble staying dead. Well, looks like we've got him on the run. Hats off. A good job by everyone. Particularly, of course, Buffalo Bill. The Indians still having trouble playing dead. One could hardly end a look at the Wild West without seeing the battle at Warbonnet Creek, or first scalp for Custer. Unfortunately, no scenes today exist of Custer's last stand, but this was at least as famous. The uniforms here are interesting. This is obviously 1890 to 1910 uniforms, probably for National Guard. They're khaki except for the officer, and these were certainly not the uniforms worn at Warbonnet Creek. Bill often enlisted the aid of the National Guard in his filming. This scene took place in 1876, right after the death of Custer, when the shocked nation got the news and everyone began to come to Montana to find the Indians that had done this. They weren't the only ones, not just the cavalry. The Cheyenne also were going to join their brethren out on the plains who'd had this great victory. General Wesley Merritt's job became very simple: stop the Cheyenne from joining the Sioux. These are possibly the best pictures I've ever seen of real Indians. And when they come across this creek, it's a chilling sight. You can just imagine being Custer standing on a hilltop, or being Buffalo Bill chasing them. I hope no one was in that tent when it collapsed. Well, let's put it back up. They never stopped the cameras for anything. Here's some of the finest footage you'll ever see of real Indians. It's much as it must have looked to those men who fought them. For this, Bill cannot be faulted. The pride and the grandeur of the Indian shows through here. Bill did locate these Indians. The scene will be a little more dramatic than it might have been. But it was Bill that found them and set up the ambush, a rather unusual situation, the United States cavalry ambushing the Indians. And if it hadn't been for two riders well out into the lead, the ambush would have been complete. But in order to save their lives, it was sprung early. This is one of my favorite scenes. Bill has discovered the Cheyenne. They haven't discovered him. But of course he's hiding behind his horse. He'll ride back and tell General Merritt that he knows where they are and where they can be found. We're going to draw this in the ground. Unfortunately, the camera misses most of it. That must have been a heck of a union if they didn't retake any of these shows. Well, Bill's weapon's right. That's the trusty Winchester. And here we go, 1900 cavalry after 1876 Indians. It's the spirit of the thing that counts. And boy, have these guys got spirit. Another one of my favorite scenes, Cheyenne covering their trail. Certainly this will confuse those scouts such as Buffalo Bill, trying to figure out what these Indians were really doing as they rode around in this circle. Makes a good picture though, doesn't it? Still great Indians. Watch the camera, guys. Watch the camera. In hot pursuit, Buffalo Bill and the cavalry. If this isn't the way it happened, perhaps it's the way it should have happened. And now we're down to the duel, Chief Yellowhand and Buffalo Bill. It was pretty much as you see it here. Maybe not quite this close. As they approached each other, Bill fires and downs the horse of Yellowhand. There he falls. Now they both jump off their horse. Actually, Bill's next shot fell at Yellowhand, but here we have to have a little hand-to-hand combat. And now we see it, the famous scene. First scalp for Custer. It became a rallying cry for all the troops, and indeed was an important event in history. It's amazing that all the people left as soon as he raised it. Oh, it was real enough, and so was Buffalo Bill. And through some very rare early footage, maybe it wasn't Academy Award-winning cinematography, but it certainly was Academy Award-winning performances. You've seen Buffalo Bill, the Wild West, and the Congress of the Rough Riders, and it's thanks to these people, and we appreciate it.